in the California Delta. We're also going to have an additional presentation to start us off this morning by Melissa Tayaba. And after that, Philip Merlo is going to continue the discussion from last week's webinar covering the history of communities of color in the Delta from the early 20th century to the present. And after Philip finishes his presentation, we're going to have comments and mini presentations by a wonderful array of panelists. So everyone joining Philip today, who is a San Joaquin County historian, includes Melissa Tayaba, and she's the Director of Traditional Ecological Knowledge and Vice Chair for the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. We have with us today Nancy Huante, who is an ethnic studies professor at CSU Sacramento, and she drives her work further as co-director at Nopal, Community, Culture, Activism, and Education, through her well-versed social justice theoretic and civil engagement policy and practice work. Nancy was born in Michoacan, Mexico, and raised in Stockton. We also have with us today Tama Brisbane, who is executive director with Our Words. Tama does amazing work with youth around history and the environment through performance and public commenting and writing in our region. We're also very lucky to have with us Vela Koba, who is the director for the Red Dragon Youth Theater, a dance collective.
Red Phoenix Rising. Red Phoenix Rising.
Red Phoenix Rising. I'm so sorry. This was the title I was given. I apologize for that. And the last person joining us a little bit later today, after about an hour in, will be Dylan Delvo, who's the executive director for Little Manila Rising. It's systematic injustice presently that's causing so much unrest in our country, from COVID-19 to education to healthcare to air quality problems to problems with policing and criminal justice reform. California water is another system that has institutionalized inequities, and the Delta Tunnel and the State Water Project are both riddled with inequities. Inequity, or rather equity and justice, can't be realized within a system that provides only the moneyed majority with all the benefits of water while excluding those with less power. The State Water Project was not built to benefit all Californians. It was only built to benefit some Californians. And therein lies the crux of the problem. So the historical approach to all of this is very important to us. As we said last week, how the boundaries were set for the Delta, as Philip explained, were very much a political decision. And in addition, in the Delta, we have represented the environmental justice, social justice struggle for years through statistics, through economics, but understanding the history of how we got here and really what needs to be changed in a narrative sense, we're actually feeling these days is even more important. So with that, I'm going to turn over the wheels to Philip and to Melissa to get started.
All righty. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So Melissa, do you want to go ahead and share your screen and get started here with your presentation? Awesome.
All right, well, I just wanted to introduce myself again. I am Melissa Tayaba. I am currently the tech director, which stands for Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And just to make a correction, I am not the vice chair of the tribe. At one time I was. Actually, I was a council member for 4 terms, but actually right now I am not sitting on council. So I just wanted to clarify that. And so I'm gonna go ahead and get into my presentation. And I just want all of you guys to know that it was very hard to pick and choose what things I should mention about the history during the 19th century for tribes. There was a lot. And so I just had a hard time deciding what I was going to pick. But I don't want anybody to think I'm not a teacher. I'm not good at doing presentations. So I did the best that I could. So I hope that you guys learned something from it. So we can go ahead and change the slide. So the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, who we are and where we come from. We are known as the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. Our original name was Verona Band of Homeless Indians. We are a federally recognized tribe. We are currently located in El Dorado County, and we sit on 160 acres of land. The rancheria was purchased by the government in 1916. We're a fairly small tribe. We're approximately about 600 tribal members, and half of them are children. And so I know that there's a lot of confusion around my tribe. A lot of people don't understand where we're from. And so we understand that. We have an understanding that our ancestors were removed from our original lands in Sutter, Yuba, Yolo, Sacramento, Placer, Amador counties creates confusion today. Furthermore, our tribal name, the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, adds to the confusion of our identity of Nisenan tribal lineage. However, those aspects of the tribe's history were beyond our control. The tribe's Aboriginal village sites and historical presence occupied the lands on the east and west banks of the Sacramento River, the confluence of the Sacramento and American, the east and west banks of the Feather River, and various points along the Cosmopolitanism River to the crest of the Sierra. Next slide. And this is just a map that shows our territory by county. Next slide. And just really quick, I had to throw this slide in there. I think it's very important to know the difference between California tribes and all other tribes. California is just unique in itself. As you can see, we have 109 federally recognized tribes in the state. So as you look at this map, you can see all of the different tribes. There's no other state that has this many tribes. So just keeping that in mind. And from 109 federally recognized tribes, there's about 100 reservations. So just to give you that backdrop of, there were a lot of Indians in California. Next slide. Ethnographic studies of the tribe. Ethnographic studies of the tribe area began as early as 1874 with Stephen Powers' accounts of Aboriginal life and resources. Other early studies included those of Barrett, Dixon, Gifford, Kroeber, and Beals. The Nisenan were the southern linguistic group of the Maiduan language family. The Nisenan, the word meaning of our side or from among us, occupied the territory that included the drainages of the American, Bear, Yuba, and the lower portions of the Feather River. The first linguistic data in Central California includes Dana's vocabularies of the Tsaletu and the Cosmopolitanism River, and Sama, Sek, and Pashuni vocabularies in the Nisenan territory. And really, those are basically villages. So in general, ethnographic descriptions came from Nisenan people themselves. We survived murder, genocide, mission life, and colonization of our homelands. And our elders passed down their memories of those terrible times. Next slide. White incursion in the end of traditional Nisenan life. It has been estimated that the population of pre-contact Sacramento Valley peoples was approximately 76,000. European contact would have a devastating effect on these numbers. Miwok territorial geography and their trade connections exposed them to European contact earlier than the Nisenan to the north. And I'm sorry, but I forgot to point out on the California map, if you saw where it had Nisenan and then Miwok. I'm sorry I forgot to point that out, but I wanted you to realize how close we were as far as just land and territory. We're neighbors. So the Miwok were our neighbors. The mission system primarily, the first Spanish expedition into Plains Miwok territory was led by Alferez Gabriel Morara in 1806. The mission system, primarily Mission San Jose de Guadalupe, began to absorb inland Miwok peoples as early as 1811. Next slide. The Nisenan largely escaped this dislocation, though Mission San Jose records indicate that in October of 1836, 4 Nisenan from the village of Pashune were baptized. Pashune was a well-established Nisenan village located at the confluence of the Sacramento and the American rivers, and the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians includes members from this lineage. During the time, roughly 10,500 natives from Central Valley and Delta were absorbed into the mission population. Like the coastal natives before them, many of these converts died of disease and hardship. American and British fur trappers, the first overland intruders into the area, included the 1832 Jonathan Work expedition, which introduced the malarial epidemic that ravaged the Central Valley in 1833. The valley groups were harder hit than the foothill villagers, since the disease is spread by mosquitoes that inhabited the Great Central Valley. Approximately 1/2, or 20,000, of the people inhabited the area died of this disease. This included syphilis, which had spread from the mission system. Next slide. And I just pointed out some of the first contacts with Nisenan people. And this is just talking about Moraga. One of the earliest documented encounters between Europeans and the Nisenan people is from the diary of Fray Pedro Munoz, who accompanied and wrote about the 1806 Moraga expedition. According to the diary, on October 4th, 1806, the expedition came upon a group of native people along the Rio de la Pasión, the Passion River, currently known as the Mokelumne River. The expedition's Miwok guide could not interpret the language of this group. It is believed that at this point, the expedition turned back due to change of linguistic affiliation of the local Indians and resulting in serviceability of his interpreter. At this place, the Miwok language was replaced by Maidu. Nisenan people were also referred to as Southern Maidu. If it is true that the Moraga expedition encountered Nisenan Southern Maidu speakers at the Mokelumne River in 1806, then it is possible that the southern boundary of Nisenan territory extended farther down than most ethnographers believe. And so this map is just showing you the rivers of where they were and where possibly the language line would have been. Next slide. Another first contact, Jedediah Smith. This was in 1827, 1828. According to Smith's journal, on March 1st, 1828, he and his group of trappers left their camp located on the Wild River, the American River, to explore the confluence of the Wild and Buenaventura Sacramento rivers. They came upon an Indian lodge and its inhabitants. The frightened inhabitants fled, and Smith recounts in his journal that one of the children died of fright from this encounter. We believe this was likely the Nisenan village of Pashune, located at the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers. And I actually want to read this. On March 1st, 1828, I went in company with the trappers down to the confluence of Wild River and the Buenaventura, which was about 2 miles from camp. The Buenaventura still continued about 300 yards wide and came from the north, maintaining the appearance of which I have before spoken, the mountain on each side about 30 miles distance. In going down Wild River, we came suddenly on an Indian lodge. Its inhabitants immediately fled. Some plunged into the river, and some took a raft, while some squaws ran down the bank of the stream. We galloped after them and overtook one who appeared very much frightened, and pacified her in the usual manner by making her some presents. I then went on to the place where I had seen one fall down. She was still laying there and apparently lifeless. She was 10 or 11 years old. I got down from my horse and found that she was in fact dead. Could it be possible, thought I, that we who called ourselves Christians were such frightful objects as to scare poor savages to death? But I had little time for meditation, for it was necessary that I should provide for the wants of my party and endeavor to extricate myself from the embarrassing situation in which I was placed. I therefore, to convince the friends of the poor girl of the regret for what had been done, covered her body with a blanket and left some trifles nearby, and in commemoration of the singular wildness of those Indians and the novel occurrence that made it appear so forcibly, I named the river on which it happened Wild River. To this river I had before that time applied a different name. Next slide. And so this is just a map showing the old channel, and then of course what it looks like today. And so that would have been the location. Next slide. Land grants and Sutter, and I really had to focus on Sutter because Sutter had a major impact on the Nisenan people. The Mexican government allowed a small number of other nationals to settle, apply for Mexican citizenship, and so become eligible to receive land grants. John Sutter established a fort in 1840 on the land grant that he named New Helvetia, on the south bank of the American River in the Valley Nisenan territory. Sutter engaged in cattle ranching, fur trapping, wheat farming, and other agricultural pursuits, and also developed a mill in the foothills in Coloma, a tannery, and also a tannery. Much of his labor was supplied by local Indians, whose services he contracted with the local chiefs. One effect of Sutter's role on Nisenan society was the disruption of family life, particularly by his supply of Indian children to landowners. Child slavery, which was outlawed under the term indentured servitude. Nisenan traditional life was also impacted by settlers taking Indian women as consorts and wives, including John Sutter and a number of his employees. It was under these conditions that the 1846 census of New Helvetia territory recorded 2,768 Nisenan and Miwok people. Next slide. And so here's just some facts. In 1839, John Sutter with a group of Hawaiians arrived in Nisenan territory at a location along the river about 3 miles above the confluence. Today, it is known as Sutter's Landing. Sutter exploited the Hawaiians and the Nisenan for slave labor and used them to build his fort, maintain the lands, and recruit new workers. Sutter engaged in slave trade, utilizing the native people of the region, which included the kidnapping and selling of women and children. Many of my relatives and ancestors were at Sutter's fort as laborers, wives, foremen, and soldiers. Sutter created an Indian garrison. The arrival of Sutter and the settlers that followed drove the Nisenan people from our homelands as village sites were abandoned and or destroyed. The Nisenan population was also devastated by the disease that European settlers brought with them as they entered the region. And when gold was discovered in 1848, the gold rush hysteria caused the mass destruction of Nisenan territory, natural resources, and traditional way of life. Next screen. And this, I put this in here because I wanted to hit on the massacres that tribes survived. And so the American military authorities present in California from 1846 operated to support the needs of American and Mexican residents who exaggerated the dangers of Indian raids and demanded that the California Indian population be controlled. Though Indian peoples turned to livestock raiding for subsistence when the Mexican-American War disrupted their traditional economies, slave raids by whites exasperated the conflict. In one situation, in July 1847, 3 whites attacked the Maidu community 60 miles north of what was now Fort Sacramento. 37 Maidu people were taken as slaves and 13 Indian people were killed. Next slide. And then just policy. I just wanted to point out what was happening with the state at that time. The federal government's Indian policy developed during this period was created to protect settler interests. Indians were required to be attached to a rancho or be otherwise employed. They were required to have a passport or they could not travel in their own homelands. White landowners could restrict access of Indians to land they had traditionally used. Their legal recourse was through Sutter, who was appointed the first federal Indian sub-agent in California in 1847. His position as the representative conflicted with his own interests. For instance, when the measles epidemic ravaged his regular workforce, that year he pressed. Sorry, I lost my line. Their legal recourse was through Sutter, who was appointed the first federal Indian sub-agent in California in 1847. His position as their representative conflicted with his own interests. For instance, when the measles epidemic ravaged his regular workforce that year, he pressed wild Indians into service. When the Nisenan near the fort held an increasing number of their ceremonies, probably in response to the epidemic, Sutter, fearing a disruptive influence, burned their dance house down. Next slide. Gold rush. Circumstances became worse for the Nisenan in 1848 when gold was discovered at Sutter's sawmill in Coloma, the Nisenan village of Coloma, on the South Fork of the American River. Trying to profit with the discovery of gold, Sutter procured Indians for mining operations as far away as Sonoma County. Other white settlers such as John Bidwell and Rancho Chico, some 90 miles northwest of Sacramento, followed Sutter's lead. Many non-Indian miners so disliked the competition that by 1849, they had driven Indian miners out of the central mining district after a period of some conflict. Sutter did not know how to deal with that situation. Next slide. And this is where we get into the massacres. They organized white military campaigns during this period were more often massacres than actual battles. In response, the California legislature passed in 1850 an act for the government and protection of Indians known as the Indian Indenture Law. It established a variety of procedures for the control of the Indian population. It permitted Native children to be indentured if they were orphans or with their parents' consent until the girl children were 15 and the boys were 18. Unattached adults could be arrested on vagrancy charges and auctioned off as laborers. The act served agricultural interests by including penalties for the firing of grassland, grasshopper hunting technique for livestock theft. Indians had little legal recourse because they could not testify against whites. And in 1851, in an effort to implement United States federal Indian policy, 3 federal commissioners worked throughout the state to negotiate treaties with California tribes. The first 2 treaties were negotiated with Indian people in March and April of the on the Mariposa and San Joaquin rivers. Unfortunately, the treaties were never ratified because in part of opposition by the ranchers who would not be able to access Indians for cheap labor had the treaties been ratified. Failure of these negotiations left Indians dependent on white society into the 20th century. Next slide. Verona. I hit on this village site because I wanted to address the Hawaiian lineage that so many people question. Major Pearson B. Reading explored and surveyed the Sacramento River. He identified a town at what was later known as Verona on a map dated 1849. The town was established, of course, near a Nisenan village, which is the ancestral home of the original members of the Shingle Springs Rancheria Band of Miwok Indians. Verona became a diverse community of cultural backgrounds, including Nisenan, Portuguese, Japanese, East Indian, African American, Korean, Chinese, and Hawaiian origins. A settlement of California Indian, Hawaiian, and Chinese formed on the banks of the Sacramento River in the later part of the 19th century that thrived for years. And this picture is a picture of my grandma and John Capu, her husband. Next slide. John Sutter's expedition included 10 men and women who came from the Hawaiian Islands. The native Hawaiians along the Nisenan from the Sacramento Valley constructed the New Helvetia settlement. John Capu married a Nisenan woman who was daughter of Nisenan of a Nisenan headman. By marrying into the Hawaiian monarchy, California Indian women could protect their property and their children during a time when the kidnapping and stealing of Indian children to become slaves was very common. John Capu and his Nisenan wife and children were among those forced to march into Round Valley in 1863 during the Maidu Trail of Tears. However, they were able to make it back. Next slide. Most local Indians were eventually left to their own devices, living in isolated parts of the country attached to non-Indian farms and households, and until the 1860s, vulnerable to enslavement. Indian women, apparently considered less of a threat than men, were allowed to do little subsistence gold mining. They were also, however, especially prey to sexual attack. They employed a number of measures to ward off such advances such as filth. Some women, however, were forced by poverty to become prostitutes. Others formed permanent relationships with non-Indian men, which in turn the Nisenan and Miwok marriage and family life suffered. By 1860, the Indian population of Sacramento County was reportedly 251. In Placer County, only 7. The Indian population was disproportionately young and male. Less than 7% of the population was over 40. Most of the approximately 24 male and female Indians living in Sacramento City were servants and under 21 years of age. Individuals and groups of others lived throughout the rest of the country, attached to households and ranches, and were enumerated as servants, day laborers, field laborers, and herders. The white flooding of the labor market left Indians primarily occupied at domestic or subsistence labor. Next slide. Newspapers from the 19th century suggest that many whites were fascinated by the exotic ways of American Indians. Still, most local accounts characterize the Nisenan and Miwok people despairingly. Most California Indians were referred to as a group called diggers. This racist term was in part a comment of Sacramento Valley Indian food gathering techniques, because a lot of our food was in the ground, so we dig root. And the picture is actually a picture of one of my relatives. And this is when they were burying somebody, and it was in the local newspaper. Next slide. Blind Tom. So this is my relative, and I felt like I wanted to focus on him because he did a lot of work with the anthropologists that were coming through the area. Next slide. So now we're getting obviously more closer to the 20th century. During the 20th century, a number of researchers explored Nisenan and Miwok traditions. Miriam was one of the first to follow powers into Nisenan and Miwok territory. Most of the researchers who wrote Northern California Indian peoples were affiliated with the University of Berkeley, Department of Anthropology. That's why a lot of our stuff is there, obviously. Kroeber authored The Valley Nisenan, published in 1929 and written primarily with the help of Tom Clenzo, an elderly blind Nisenan of about 70 years of age. His brother, Mike Clenzo, worked for Sutter. Clenzo was the last inhabitant of Kadema, which is another village. He was impoverished and depended on local hop field owners and friends and relatives in the Indian community living in Sacramento. Yet he reportedly managed to travel several miles on his own in Sacramento. He was actually blind, and he was a weaver, and he obviously could find his way around. Next slide. The work with Clenzo was unique because the traditional Valley Nisenan communities had disintegrated by that time as people were pushed out by development or sought land based in the rancherias that were established in the 1910s and 20s. Next slide. And then this is kind of where more modern history comes, where right here in the beginning of the 1900s, the tribe and its members are descendants of Nisenan Indians that inhabited the central part of California for thousands of years until contact with Europeans. Against this historical backdrop, in 1916, a special Indian agent, Mr. John Terrell, working for the Department of Interior, conducted a census of Indians living in the depressed conditions along the Sacramento River and in and around Sacramento. Upon identifying their needs, Mr. Terrell set about trying to acquire land for these homeless Indians in El Dorado, California, which is now the Shingle Springs Rancheria. Finally, in 1920, under the authority of the Homeless Indian Act of June 21st, 1906 and April 30th, 1908, Mr. Terrell was able to obtain a deed for the 160-acre Shingle Springs Rancheria for the use and occupancy of the Sacramento Verona Band of Homeless Indians. On March 11th, 1920, the United States Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs accepted the trust title to the 160-acre parcel of rocky, uninhabited land in El Dorado County. And so that is how we became when it came to the state. Next slide. And these are my last slides. These are in closing. Obviously, my tribe, we are survivors. Without a doubt, my people, the Nisenan, are the people of the valley. The 19th century was a hard time, and my elders found a way to survive. The tribe should not be questioned about who they are or where they come from. My tribe and its people were the original scientists and were true geniuses, as we have many roles as women and as men. The Nisenan people are alive and well. We are thinkers, we're dreamers, we're doctors, we're feather keepers, we're bow makers, we're basket weavers, we're fishermen, and we're singers. The Nisenan people discovered how to weave watertight baskets. Baskets are everything. That's how we ate. When you were born, you were put in a basket. We cooked our food in a basket, and when you die, you're in a basket. We have a relationship to the waterways of this region, a relationship with the land and all it has provided and what it still offers. Next slide. And our relationship with the Delta. We have a relationship with the Delta as it provided everything we needed. We used the Delta for hunting, fishing, gathering food, basketry materials, housing materials, and clothing materials. The Delta is the heart of the region that has sustained the numerous plants, animal, and human resources and natural resources since time immemorial. The tribal people of this area have and will always continue to be stewards of these resources for the communities that they represent, as well as the communities that live in these resourced areas. And I wanted to bring up fire. Fire was important for the health of the region for all resources in the area. And next slide. And that is my conclusion. I don't know if anybody has questions. I know that I felt like I really wasn't able to talk about the culture of my people. And so maybe that would come at a later time. But I am open for questions if anybody has any.
Melissa, we did have a question that came in, and the question was, do the members of the Shingle Springs tribe, do you still speak your native language or a combination of native languages?
Question. Thank you for that question. So Sutter devastated my tribe so much that at one point we lost our language. We almost lost our culture. We lost our language. But the good thing is that we do have tribal members who brought the language back. And so we do have speakers right now, and we actually are teaching it to the children. You know, we're just thankful that our ancestors left a lot behind for us. And so we are just using it and trying to teach everybody. So yes, the language has been revitalized and it's back.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Kristen Loomis. If you could talk a little bit more about the use of fire.
Yeah. Well, you know, fire for us is important. And with what you're taught now, you know, they taught us about Smokey the Bear, and they taught us that fire was bad and it's dangerous. But actually in our culture, there's fire people, and fire is an element and it's alive. And fire did so much for us. There's a purpose for fire, but we used it because it replenished our food and our food for us and food for the plants and the animals. And so the traditional burning is something that we actually have been bringing back. And we do have areas that we burn. And for basketry, the traditional burns is what we need, because you will get your straight sticks faster and quicker and better. And so fire is a necessity to us, and it's something that we're not allowed to use. And currently right now we have our own tribal fire department, and that's actually one of the things that I'm working on, is bringing back traditional burning. So yes, fire is very important to us.
That is a very interesting topic for us. We have questions pending at the Q&A about assisting you with linguistic research and people interested in getting in contact with you. So I think what we can do, Melissa, is I think we can maybe have Philip get started, so we kind of try to keep a little bit to our time schedule. And if you would like to go in the Q&A and answer those questions from your screen, you are more than welcome to do so. And then we'll add, we're going to share contacts after this webinar, and we'll keep an eye on everything, and we'll add in more questions as we go. Okay.
Alrighty. Should I go ahead and take over then?
Yeah, it's kind of hard after that presentation, though.
I understand.
Yeah, it feels awfully rushed, Melissa, and we're really grateful to you.
Yeah,
Oh, we lost you. I think you're muted. If you can unmute your screen, Melissa. There we go. We didn't hear you.
yeah, it was very, very rushed. Like I said, there was so much that I could have given, but how do you pick what to give? And like I said, I just tried to hit on certain key things like the villages that we're from, and there's so much more out there. And like I said, like you could Google it, and a lot of stuff will come up if anybody needs, if anybody would like to try to access more information, it's there.
We definitely would, in a post-COVID world, we look forward to having you in the Delta so that we can have some more of these conversations face to face.
Thank you.
Philip?
Alrighty. Taking over. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Should say loading. We good?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. So thank you so much, Melissa. I'm glad that you had time to cover a little bit of the really deep history of your community. We're going to go ahead and just really briefly review the objectives from the last presentation and move forward with today's. So again, the objectives for this presentation and this panel more broadly is that we need to understand that the existence of the current California Delta as a physical and economic space was and is made possible by the labor and culture of communities of color. And secondly, we need to frame the construction of conveyance infrastructure to increase water exports for agriculture and desert housing as a state-sanctioned white supremacist threat to the livelihoods of low-income communities in the California Delta, which we'll get to towards the end of today. Just again, reorienting ourselves, this is the California Delta as we know it today. It's currently politically divided between a primary and a secondary zone, which, as we'll see, they're political terms that de facto reduce and marginalize the human histories, cultures, societies, and politics of the region. And we're actually looking at the broader Delta Valley of the entire region that relies on Delta economy and the Delta infrastructure for its livelihood, which is backed up by historical maps from prior to the designation of the primary and secondary zone. And the process that we're really looking at, that we've looked at, exploring and settling new territory, reaping the benefits of genocide and pandemic, importing labor for capitalist usage of the land. We really ended the presentation last week with the importation of Chinese labor from Taishan province in Guangdong, Taishan County in Guangdong province in southern China. Today, we're going to continue with that while also talking a lot about the disenfranchisement of communities by the metropole, as in the center of economic and political power, usually in this case, a city. We're really thinking about Sacramento. We're looking at the Bay Area. We're looking at LA, as well as the erasure of human narratives for political ends. All right, successive waves of immigrant labor, oppression, and community resilience. So just going over this real quick, what we haven't time to cover because there's just so much history. We're really basically covering the 20th century today. We're not going too in depth into the social or cultural histories of the communities we're talking about. We will touch on it, but it's not going to be central. We're more looking at economic and political issues. We won't be discussing the complexities of California water law or of the ecological history of the Delta per se. We won't be going over environmental zoning laws and their discriminatory practice in the Delta, especially in Stockton and Sacramento. And we also won't be touching too much on the history of housing segregation in the Delta, although it will come up definitely in some critical ways. And then a note on cosmopolitanism. I got a lot of responses, about 6 or 7 emails last week from folks who wanted to know if I was going to talk about various ethnic communities in the Delta. And one thing that needs to be said is that while Stockton and Sacramento and Vallejo and Fairfield and Brentwood and Antioch are generally seen as some of the most diverse cities in the country today, they've always been ethnically and culturally diverse places. Across the region since 1850, there have been large communities of indigenous Hawaiians, Spanish laborers from Hawaii, Tahitians, people from the Basque Land, Chilenos from Valparaiso in Chile, Koreans, especially in the Manteca and Lathrop areas, Punjabis, which the construction of the first Gurdwara in America was in Stockton, and there were a lot of Punjabi Sikhs who worked in Delta agriculture, Volga Germans in Lodi and Galt, Bavarians in historic Brentwood and Antioch, Dutch people in kind of the nexus, or where the San Joaquin River splits into 3. Greeks, Lebanese, Assyrians, Palestinians, Ukrainians, Moldovans, Yakuts people from Siberia have all settled in this region. And due to time constraints, it would be impossible to cover all of these communities. And more honestly, it'd be a disservice and dishonor to frame those in such a short time frame. And a note on the alchemy of race in the Delta and in the United States more broadly. We're going to be talking very briefly today about Italian and Portuguese people, and the access and inclusion to white racial identity in the United States has grown over time as different European communities from outside of Western Europe have adopted or assimilated into dominant Anglophone American society, took place in capitalist processes, and invested in American ideology. And as a result, dominant notions of whiteness evolved to expand to include basically most of Judeo-Christian Eurasian ancestry. So it was possible for an Italian person or a Lebanese person or a Ukrainian person to immigrate to the Delta in the 1890s and be seen as a person of color. And then 40 years later, by all accounts, be listed in census documents, tax documents as white. Right, as race is a social construct, it's malleable over time and space. And with that, Japanese, Italian, and Portuguese immigration, really looking at 1880 to 1924. Push and pull factors. So the second European imperial age in the late 19th century and the coterminous rise of modern Western medicine led to dramatic increases in birth rates and decreasing economic opportunities in much of, I use quotation marks, the developing world of the second half of the 19th century. And so newly emergent and newly formed European states such as Italy, Germany, and Greece, as well as declining European empires such as Portugal, Spain, and the transcontinental Ottoman Empire, had expanding populations, but decreasing economic opportunities for those populations, which led to a lot of emigration to the Americas. In colonized Eurasia, so for the areas of Eurasia that had been colonized predominantly by the British, the French, and the Russian empires, you also had expanding populations as a result of the importation of Western medicine, as well as you also had unfavorable trade relations in China, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, right? Because in the imperial economy, you had the very cheap products of the metropole being sold. So, for example, cheap manufactured goods from London being sold at artificially low prices in the colonized world. And that led to a decline in economic opportunity in those places, which fueled similar emigration across the globe. In Japan, the Meiji Restoration and the rise of the Japanese Empire, which was a political and military rebellion against the Tokugawa shogunate in the late 1860s, which led to the modernization of the Japanese state. That's a very big simplification, and I apologize for that. Led to similar population pressures, as well as foreign policies In the Japanese Empire, known as Bunmei Kaika, which translates to civilization and enlightenment, with the idea being that you could import the aspects of European and Western political culture and economic culture that could be used to propel the Japanese Empire to a state of equity and equality with the European empires. There's also a state-sponsored agenda of settler colonialism in Oceania and the Americas, where the Japanese government would actually sponsor and propagandize the idea of moving to California or Seattle or Japan or Canada or Polynesia or Peru or Brazil or Argentina to go and actually open up farms in those areas using Japanese financial capital. So there are definitely a lot of push and pull factors sending and pushing a lot of immigration into California and the Delta. There we go. And of course, most of this immigration came through Angel Island on the West Coast, Ellis Island on the East Coast. Japanese settler colonialism and capital. So Japanese immigration to the Delta region really began in the 1890s and increased substantially in the 1900s until the Gentleman's Agreement of 1911, which essentially de facto banned immigration from Japan to the United States. Most immigrants came from agricultural districts of Kyushu and Honshu, such as Kurume or Kurume Prefecture in Kyushu or Kanagawa Prefecture in the Kanto Plain in Honshu, in regions that had historic practice of levee and dike agriculture, where essentially they were from deltas and they had very strong experience in understanding how to use levees to maximize agricultural output. And on Delta Islands, where a lot of these Japanese laborers would end up, they participated in a spectrum where initially a lot of them worked in wage labor or sharecropping, and eventually they began to lease land from a lot of the corporate interests in San Francisco, Lodi, Stockton, and Sacramento that owned most of the land. And eventually the elusive idea of ownership. Because of the alien land law, ownership was quite difficult to achieve. However, because of the ability of many of the Issei, the first generation of Japanese immigrants, to actually bring families or subscribe through picture bride arrangements, a lot of them were able to actually own land through their children. In Stockton and Sacramento, there was a deep settler economy of mercantile trade and charters and service economies that thrived to support this agricultural economy of the Japanese settler class. And the Japanese settler economy achieved agricultural dominance very early on with respect to other cultural and ethnic communities in the Delta. There were select Japanese agriculturalists that, much like their Chinese predecessors, were able to utilize East Asian farming practices to achieve financial viability of land use. In particular, operations managed by Ushijima Kenji, or George Shima, which is portraited here, as well as the Tanaka, Nakashima, Yamada, and Seiki families, were able to dramatically improve and expand the area of Delta land available for potato agriculture, as well as later for strawberries and squash. And essentially what they were able to understand is that, especially George Shima, because he was from Kurume, which is a Delta town in Kyushu, he was able to recognize that there was a lot of land that, because of how levees had been constructed, was being underutilized. And because he had experience in Kurume with potato agriculture, sweet potato agriculture, he was able to rapidly expand his economic empire. And by 1911, he was the wealthiest man in the Delta, by far one of the wealthiest people in California. He would, I did the math based off of estimates of his wealth in 1914. He would be wealthier than Alex Spanos was when he passed away. Alex Spanos being a billionaire from Stockton. The Japanese Empire abroad. Unlike Chinese migrant labor, the Japanese immigrant experience in the Delta was influenced by the existence of Japanese foreign policy agendas. that were dedicated to claiming imperial legitimacy, racial superiority in Pacific context, and a strong settler colonial mission. And resultantly, the Japanese settler economy of the Delta had access to Japanese capital networks, a robust literary culture that was fundamental in providing a highly educated community, imperial representation in American domestic affairs. It was very common for the Japanese government to send ambassadors and diplomats and business people from Tokyo or Yokohama to San Francisco, Sacramento, and Stockton to negotiate on behalf of Japanese farmers and laborers, as well as support and organizing chapters of the Nihonjinkai, the Japanese Association of America, which served as a community organizing tool to support Japanese business and community efforts in this area. And these supports were critical in allowing for urban Japanese communities in Stockton and Sacramento to become the wealthiest ethnic neighborhoods per capita in the Delta. It's hard to understate the fact that for most of the early 20th century, the wealthiest two neighborhoods in the Delta Valley were Japantowns, right? And that's a history that's largely been erased in part because of the Japanese internment, but also in part because of urban renewal. And so just, some interesting photos. George Shima was known as the Potato King. He's the gentleman seen here in the debonair white suit. This gentleman was the president of Stanford University at the time. And this is Joichi Saedo, the president of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce. Because of Shima's wealth, there were a lot of cartoons, both in English and in Japanese, portraying him. There were biographies, popular biographies in Japanese language of Shima written at the time. And one thing that's really important to think about is that Shima was someone who had a lot of political power back in Japan, because he was critical in developing relationships between Holt Manufacturing Company and the Japanese military. And so the Japanese military was actually highly well stocked with technological innovation from the time period. A very politically influential person. And the Stockton Japantown and Sacramento Japantowns, again, were two of the wealthiest places in California, and were host to a lot of businesses and hotels and stores and fairly upscale medical practices as well. And you can find this map if you go to Densho, which is a Japanese historical memory and organizing site. They have maps of all the Japantowns in California and on the West Coast. And yet capitalism and the capitalism of the Japanese Empire had its limits. While Japanese immigrants to the Delta did have access to capital networks and technical expertise, they were still marginalized within the context of a white supremacist political regime. Land ownership was severely restricted due to California's alien land laws, with many Issei owning land in the name of their children or in the form of LLCs. Furthermore, urban housing and movement were restricted into special districts, variously referred to as Japanese quarters, J-towns, or the Japanese language term Nihonmachi. These districts were enforced through racially restrictive housing covenants, much like all of the ethnic communities in the United States at that time. There's also a lot of police violence, retail segregation, and social exclusion from white community organizations. Really good example of this. The Hotel Stockton, the beautiful Mission Revival Hotel in downtown Stockton, was actually, for the most part, funded for and paid for by George Shima. But his name was not allowed to be on the building. He was not even necessarily allowed to attend the opening. There's no good data that suggests that he was actually there. He wasn't mentioned in newspaper articles at the time. And the reason for this, of course, is that the Hotel Stockton was in an area that was north of Weber and north of Main Street, and it was not really seen as a place where people of color could live or stay, even though Shima built Shima's rationale that we understand for funding the construction of the Hotel Stockton was to house diplomats from Japan that came to visit with him. In more rural settings, lynchings and mob violence against Japanese was common, very common between 1900 and 1924. especially kind of at a 1919 and 1920 was really the point in time where it hit a peak in terms of the number of racial incidents. You saw a lot of racist editorials in the newspapers. These are from the Stockton Record, Stockton Independent. Japanese are worse than Chinese. The influx into the state is becoming more alarming. More Japs arrive in Stockton. Pardon the use of a slur. State anti-Jap committee will have local men, will hold a meeting in Stockton. Lawrence Edwards and Todd Cloudsley were very influential business people in the Delta. And so important to understand that there was definitely institutional rhetorical violence. There was also a lot of actual physical violence that was taking place. Very common at this time period to find articles in Stockton and Japanese newspapers concerning Japanese and also Chinese people who would be under quote unquote mysterious circumstances or quote unquote unknown circumstances be found hanging under bridges or hanging from trees. All of these were classified as suicides. I find that very unlikely, especially given business and tax records into who was found hanging. Typically, you find wealthy farmers or wealthy farm managers who would be essentially, depending on historical interpretation, lynched. You also saw that these would typically take place a few days after Japanese unionization in the fields or vineyards, or after essentially there would be situations where a Japanese man or a Japanese woman would be seen doing something or would be reported on doing something as being against standards of American domestic normalcy. Of course, which was a very racist double standard at the time. So definitely there was a context and a history of anti-Japanese violence. This also took shape in essentially vigilante murders, where the murderers would not be held accountable for their actions, very relevant within the context of today. I'm not even going to really read this. This is a pretty gruesome article from June 25th, 1908 in the Stockton Record. And of course, there was also a very, very vibrant maybe isn't the right word, very robust Ku Klux Klan in Stockton that was historically tied to, and I could get in trouble here, the American Legion. In terms of the organizing capacity. So there's a lot of anti-Japanese violence. This is a mistyped quote here, I apologize, or label. And the Ku Klux Klan was very anti-Japanese in its stance. Simultaneously, the Delta Valley also saw a large influx of Italian and Azorean migrants who were broadly relegated to work first in heavy industrial labor in canneries and warehouses, but also working in orchards and vineyards. I'm not going to cover them too in depth, but they were subject to similar urban segregation and policing policies in Stockton and Sacramento. But they were able to typically integrate into capitalist systems because they had access to capital from New York and St. Louis and Chicago on the East Coast. And these communities also suffered, especially a lot of anti-Catholic violence in Stockton in particular during this time period. And if you read the Stockton Record during this time period, there were numerous lynchings of Italian and Portuguese migrants to the area. And these communities over time, in contrast to the Japanese experience, were able to really reclaim standards of whiteness because of essentially shared cultural heritage with Western Europe via the Renaissance and with Western European descended Americans via Columbus. So one of the reasons why Columbus Day is a very problematic and discussed thing in Italian culture is because he has traditionally been claimed as a as a symbol of Italian Americanness, despite the fact that he was genocidal. So interesting complications there. By 1920, employment segregation had ended in the region for Italian and Portuguese communities. By the 1930s, Italians were actually able to purchase small plots of land in the Delta. And by 1950, residential segregation ended. All right, century of Filipino and Mexican labor. We're moving fast. The Johnson Bill and the birth of a new regime. Okay, I'm looking at all these comments. Okay. So in 1924, an act was passed despite the fierce lobbying against it by Japanese and Italian interests in California, called the Johnson Immigration Act, which restricted immigration to the United States to 2% of 1890 levels from any host country. And what this did is it basically stated that only 3,800 Italians, I think like 3,000 people from Portugal, even smaller for most of the rest of the Mediterranean, and I think it was like 10 from Japan or some crazy small number like that. Only those small numbers were allowed to immigrate to the United States on work visas with the intent of eventually becoming citizens. And that created a massive labor shortage in the Delta. And what that essentially did was it made it very difficult for the Anglo agricultural agribusiness class, as well as the increasingly large Japanese capitalist agribusiness class in the Delta, made it very difficult for these communities to access labor. And so what they did is they actually started looking around and recruiting trade and charter companies in American colonies, such as the Philippines, which had been colonized by the United States in 1904, to actually immigrate to the Delta. And because of Sperry Flour Company, which I don't have time to go into today, but Sperry Flour Company was a Stockton-based transnational corporation founded in the 1850s that eventually by 1870 had a monopoly in the Philippine archipelago and in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia in flour sales. And there were trade and charters that were headquartered in San Francisco and had offices in Hong Kong, Manila, and Singapore. And basically the agribusiness class of the Delta, using their farm bureaus, using their cooperative boards, actually entered into contracts with these companies. I have Lutz and Company here, Warner Barnes and Company on the right. And they would actually enter into contracts with these companies and engage in a really insidious labor scheme where they would recruit the legal designation of Filipino residents were wards of the state. They were not US citizens. And they would actually go out and recruit poor Filipino men or lower middle class Filipino men from Manila, from throughout Luzon, from the Visayas, some from Mindanao. And they would actually go out and market California and the Delta as a place to move to, using advertisements that marketed teaching and accounting positions that did not in fact exist because of employment segregation. And it was really interesting. So this is like from 1921, or 1923, excuse me. So the very first large wave of Filipino laborers to Stockton was in 1923. And within a week of that, there was an editorial about how the Filipino community was claiming employment discrimination because the types of jobs advertised in the employment agencies, when for many reasons they should be given preference over other foreigners, basically all of the types of jobs that they had been recruited for, a lot of low pay service labor and intellectual labor, were actually only being recruited. They were only recruiting Italians, Mexicans, and Greeks. And I've actually been able to find some of these blackboards. And the only jobs available to the Filipino community were working in asparagus fields, vineyards, and in some cases, canneries. And there were a lot of editorials from that time period about this. And so within a few years, a lot of the Filipino community of the Delta became organized through employment agencies, through community organizing efforts, and would essentially become the agricultural backbone of the Delta economy in asparagus agriculture and in asparagus canning, which of course asparagus was the largest cash crop in Stockton and in the Central and South Delta for most of the 20th century. And I'm going over this at light speed because I know that Dylan Delvo is going to be on the call, and people can always check out Little Manila is in the Heart, the magnum opus of the late Don Mabalan, who covered this history in detail. Of course, you could see Delta asparagus workers could expect to, Filipino asparagus workers could expect to work for 12 hours a day during the harvest. They lived in the same buildings at this point, quite run down, as the Chinese and Japanese agricultural labor class from the early 20th century and late 19th century. A lot of these buildings are still there with archaeological remnants. I mean, you can still see, this is at my great-grandfather's farm site, where he purchased in the 1950s. And you can actually still see bed springs from their camp barracks. And I dated these. These are actually from 1927. They actually have serial numbers on them. So a lot of these archaeological remnants still exist. And of course, in the urban spaces where the Filipino community would congregate as part of their larger West Coast labor circuit, there was really intense retail and spatial segregation that was vigorously enforced via passive programming, right? You'd see signs that said positively no Filipinos allowed inside a lot of fancier hotels or stores. There are also constant threats of police and mob violence. This is more images of short-handle hoe agriculture. As you can see, this is very uncomfortable. There were clubs that were bombed. This is in 1930, where a Filipino club was bombed in Stockton. There were, there's a really, really gruesome article that I did not share because I think it would have been seen as triggering, of Filipinos being lynched in Lodi in the late 1920s, I think 1927. This was a constant threat of violence that these people were subjected to as a result of the capitalist logic of this white supremacist regime that existed in the Delta. There's also a lot of police violence. This person, a Filipino man who was given 25 days for disturbing the peace. There was a claim that the Japanese man sported a black eye, $50 fine, 25 days in jail. This looks like the Stockton record at the time had a typo. There were a lot of times where Filipino men would be arrested for either talking to, or in some cases, hiring white women, in some cases, people who worked in brothels, where because of miscegenation laws that were quite common. Oftentimes, if you look at the Stockton record, these would be cached right next to some article about the KKK, which was very intentional, or at least can't be seen in the, through the lens of historical study as not being intentional. You also have a lot of violence where there would be organized efforts by farmers to have night riders or KKK style raids on migrant labor camps. And of course, when the Filipino communities, especially the communities in the asparagus canneries, would organize, they would be met by mob violence. So there was a strike in 1937. You can look this up yourself, but it was quite one of the preeminent, most historically studied strikes in American history was the asparagus cannery strike of 1937 in Stockton. And the Governor Miriam, called in the National Guard, violently put this down. The American Legion organized essentially a mob to fight a lot of and persecute a lot of the Filipinx community that was involved in this strike. There were other strikes as well. This is just one that's been very highly historically studied. They were almost always met with displays of military force. And again, I want to underscore, the really horrible human violence that was perpetrated against Filipino men in particular. This article, Unidentified Man, apparently a transient, found hanging on a trestle. It took place near Tidewater Southern Railroad, 3 miles southwest of Stockton. And I actually went through and looked at the sheriff's records, and this was a Filipino man. So again, this was a very common experience. And I think if you read popular literature by people such as Carlos Bulosan, who wrote America is in the Heart, about his experience in the Western United States during this time period, it was a nightmare. And a lot of, at this time, you saw the formation of farm bureaus and farm bureau federations in the early 20s and into the 1930s as a means of both sharing agricultural technology and science, but also working to lobby the government to allow for the importation of labor, because by this point, the agricultural economy of the Delta and the Central Valley was predicated on low-income labor. Which takes us to our next topic, the Mexican communities of the Delta. And in the 1920s, an increasingly large number of Mexican families from Michoacan, Jalisco, Guerrero, and Oaxaca provinces in Mexico emigrated to the Central Valley and the Monterey Basin in the Salinas Valley, looking to escape from civil unrest, violence, and poor economic outlooks in agricultural industries in Mexico as a result of imperialism during the Mexican Civil War of 1911 to 1920. In 1929, President Herbert Hoover authorized the federally managed deportation of between 400,000 and 2 million Mexicans from California, many of whom were naturalized citizens. This placed serious labor crunches on agricultural industries that relied on Mexican labor in the Delta. And this largely meant orchard crops, corn, and increasingly vineyards struggled with access to labor during the Great Depression. Come on, there we go. And this led to a lot of lobbying from farm bureaus in the Delta and in the Monterey Basin for relief from the federal government, especially between 1936 and 1942, where agribusiness interests in California, Texas, and Missouri fought for the federal government to provide labor relief. And this took shape in the form of a treaty between the US and Mexico, where men from Guadalajara and Mexico City could sign up to work in California. And the terms of the treaty were typically not upheld by Anglo farmers. And abuses, especially in the Delta, were very common. There's a really great book, titled "Grounds for Dreaming" by May Nye, who is a historian at Columbia University that goes into this in more depth. One thing that I was able to discover just digging into some of her primary resources that's really relevant to today is that the commission that managed the program in California, so the Bracero program in California, the department was led by Carrie McWilliams, interestingly enough. But the commission that actually managed the program was led by Delta farmers. William B. Parker was a Stockton farmer who I was able to discover in newspaper articles. He was a Klansman. He was actually the director of the commission. And in addition to farmer, there was a farmer from Clarksburg, there was a farmer from Lodi, there was a farmer from Galt, and there was one farmer from the Salinas Valley who was actually in charge of the commission that managed the Bracero program in California in the 40s. So that tells you a little bit about the nature of Delta agriculture, especially because the Stockton Bracero Center, which I'll want to show. These are Braceros immigrating to or moving to Stockton via train car. the Stockton Bracero Center actually had the largest number of complaints of any Bracero Center in the country outside of Texas. And in California, almost all of those complaints were buried. By the late 1930s, and especially into the 1940s and 50s, there was also another wave of Chicanx immigration, in part consisting of Bracero families, but also the families of many formerly illegally deported families from the 1929 to 1936 deportation era. And in Stockton's case, most of these families actually ended up living in El Barrio del Chivo, which was demolished in urban renewal. And of course, the Filipino and Mexican communities were incredibly organized in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There were dozens of strikes that were organized by people such as Larry Itliong, eventually by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez into the 1960s with the formation of the UFW. I don't necessarily have time to talk about the day. I think I've got 10 minutes left, and I want to cover through the rest of the presentation. But definitely a lot of great historical literature has been written on this. And I'll make sure that I share some in the bibliography. And now I want to talk about one topic that has not been historically studied at all, and that's Black labor in the urban Delta. And I'm going to really focus on a morphogenesis of, and I see Jaime Cader's message to all panelists. They were deported. Yes, they were actually born in the United States. Most of them were American citizens. I actually have conducted a lot of oral histories with some of the children who were deported, who were born in the United States. And it's a really tragic story. And again, because of time constraints, I don't necessarily have time to talk about it today. Black labor in the urban Delta, I'm going to give a morphogenesis of Stockton's industrial complex, which I think historically has been seen as focused on agriculture. There's actually another element to Stockton, or agricultural manufacturing, so like tractors, bulldozers. There's another element to Stockton's industrial complex that has a lot to do with Black northern migration migrants. Just some context, early African-American settlers, extant archival records show that at least 60 enslaved Africans lived in San Joaquin County, over 100 in Sacramento County prior to the Civil War, despite California being a free state. However, due to the lucrative wages of working in industrial gold mines, many of these enslaved Africans were actually able to purchase their freedom and open farms, and most of those farms end up in southeast and southwest Stockton. This is a photo of Emmanuel Quivers. Emmanuel Quivers was a gentleman who had worked in iron foundries in Richmond, Virginia, prior to the United States Civil War as essentially an enslaved laborer. And he was incredibly educated. He would actually pioneer and lead to the desegregation of Stockton schools in the 1870s and 1880s, and was highly involved with the community organizing efforts on the East Coast, and was actually a very strong correspondent of W.B. Du Bois. And in the late 19th century, large numbers of formerly enslaved Africans from Arkansas, Missouri, and southern Appalachia fled the South due to the rise and crystallization of Jim Crow laws. It was actually across the entire South, but to Stockton in particular from these three areas. And these communities had specialized in lumber industries in Appalachia and the Ozarks. I think there's a popular narrative that's portrayed in U.S. history textbooks and also in U.S. academia that the only enslaved Africans that there were people who had been enslaved on cotton plantations, but the entire Southern economy was predicated on slave labor. And as a result, there were a lot of formerly enslaved Africans who had a lot of expertise in industries such as lumber or fishing. And there were a lot of great northern migration migrants who migrated to lumber mills in Calaveras County, Amador County, Siskiyou County, and Trinity County. most of them owned by lumber yards in Stockton. And interesting fact, the Western Association of Forestry Industries had its headquarters in Stockton for a long time. And in Stockton, there's a large forest products industrial complex that sat in southwestern Stockton along Mormon Slough, which was then navigable, which had harbor and barge access. In this area, which was already inhabited by Californios and some of the early African-American settlers, including Emanuel Quivers, very quickly became the center of Stockton's Black community. And this is just a photo of African-American forestry professionals from Arkansas and Oklahoma at the Quincy Mill. But if you look at the labor records of the Stockton box mills in Calaveras County, at West Point, the lumber mills in Weed, California, lumber mills in Amador County, many of their laborers were African migrants. And if you look at sandboard maps from that time period, you can actually see this. The African Methodist Episcopalian Church was in this area of Section 8 of Stockton, and the historic Boggs Tract area was 21, 17, and 20, and the second part of 21, as well as kind of the southern part of Section 8. And these areas, if you go back in census records and look at the addresses and who was living where, were about 90% African American in the early 20th century. Tried to zoom in on this Library of Congress Sanborn map. I apologize, kind of blurry, but you can see Stockton Lumber Company is right along Mormon Slough. This is the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. This is the Lincoln Drugstore, which I can't really find too much information on, but I would assume that it was a pharmaceutical practice that was selling to African American migrants. And this area, of course, was on a floodplain and was subject to very common floods, still is today. This community was very engaged in community organizing against bills that would infringe on voting rights or infringe on, municipal ordinances that would infringe on their educational prospects. They were also very active in organizing against the Ku Klux Klan in Stockton and were very successful in that matter. Keep going. In the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl drought of the late 1920s and early 1930s, there's also extensive African-American migration from Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, and Arkansas into the maritime industries of the Delta. The port of Stockton by this point was the fastest growing port in US history over a 7-year time span between 1933 and 1940. And the vast majority of laborers that were hired based off of employment records were actually African-American longshoremen from along the Mississippi River all the way down into Louisiana and New Orleans. And most of these families were forced to initially live in camps at modern-day Lewis Park, which became Pixie Woods. And eventually these communities would find that the housing markets in traditionally African-American neighborhoods on Boggs Tract and Lower East Side were saturated, and that North Stockton was, of course, segregated by racially restrictive housing covenants and by this point redlining. And so a lot of these communities would move into areas that were affected by white flight, such as the Midtown Magnolia, Fair Oaks, and Burgerside, which is why those neighborhoods today are traditionally very African-American. And really critical that to focus on the fact that the Port of Stockton's maritime industrial complex, which built all kinds of really critically important things during World War II, such as on-demand aircraft carrier and battleship maintenance platforms like this that could be shipped all around the Pacific Rim. They built the landing boats for D-Day and for Iwo Jima. They were all built by African-American laborers, and this was a huge, huge element of the Delta economy at the time. And of course, the documentary evidence and the photographic evidence really clears this up. These are Black, Chicano, and Italian laborers at a strike near the Port of Stockton from the 1930s. And of course, as a result of all of this immigration, you really had the creation of an urban delta in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, with neighborhoods such as Little Manila, the Japantown, there's a Chinatown, the Boggs Tract, El Barrio del Chivo, the Fair Oaks District, very diverse, of incredibly diverse labor communities in the Delta. And if you look at histories of Sacramento, which I haven't been focusing too much on, very similar histories with Northwest and South Sacramento. Metropoles in the colony. Last 8 minutes, I'm going to have some calls to action for people to do some research and some stuff that hasn't really been published on, but which the evidence backs up. State prerogatives and disenfranchisement. When I refer to the state, I'm generally referring to the Los Angeles and Bay Area dominated state government. So prior to the Central Valley Project, the San Joaquin River salmon run was one of the largest on the West Coast. And in 1932 alone, the Stockton and Delta fishing, South Delta fishing industries were catching 400 to 500,000 pounds of salmon a year. And the construction of the Central Valley Project, basically, and what I'm getting at is it was a huge part of the economy that was relatively diverse. This is a photo of Italian salmon fishermen, but a lot of fishermen from the Mediterranean, a lot of Japanese people participated in this. A lot of Black migrants from the South, especially from Louisiana and Mississippi, would end up working in salmon canneries. And the destruction of this industry was really the result of the Central Valley Project, where the construction of dams in the San Joaquin Valley basically destroyed the ecosystems that the salmon relied on. And this was an example of, and there was actually a fishing lobby that advocated against the Central Valley Project. At the time, there was a really important push in state government to provide for more water so that the South San Joaquin Valley could become populated, because at the time it was variously marshes and deserts and not a lot of people lived there. The internment and the theft of Japanese wealth. Some of the largest advocates of Japanese internment in California, who were actively lobbying the federal government to actually enact Japanese internment, were capitalists from San Francisco, LA, and Fresno. And one of the reasons for this, of course, it's hard for me to understand exactly why. I've been trying to delve into this. But if you actually look at who benefited in the Delta from the Japanese internment and the forced relocation of a lot of Japanese agricultural laborers and capitalists, a lot of companies from San Francisco were actually able to purchase a lot of these lands that had been owned by people like the Yamadas and the Shimas at very low prices, essentially 1/20th on the dollar, according to the letters and business documents I've seen. Haven't been able to do this or make this study in a thorough analytical matter. So this is definitely something that needs to be looked into more by historians. State rationalism and the deconstruction of the urban delta in both Sacramento and Stockton, the urban neighborhoods that would be demolished for the construction of freeways were essentially neighborhoods that have been inhabited by African Americans, by Filipinos, and by Japanese and Chinese laborers, as well as by Mexican labor. And that's why, like, if you look at historic maps of Sacramento, the area where you get off on J Street on I-5, that area was a historic Black neighborhood, right? The Little Manila, of course, the western edge of Little Manila at this point, you can see over here was demolished for the construction of the freeway. This area right here is where all those homes where the Boggs Tract community was. Like this was the African-American neighborhood. So anytime you drive over the intersection of Highway 4 and I-5 in Stockton, you're driving over a demolished African-American neighborhood, as well as, urban renewal. Because of the construction of the freeways, the a lot of the land in these areas, and because of also the destruction of the industries, a lot of the lands in these areas would actually eventually be classified for urban renewal. That's a really complicated history. You should read Little Manila's on the Heart. Of course, also killing the commons. Sacramento still has a lot of public access to water. In the early 20th century, most people in Stockton were very active in Delta recreation, and by the 1960s, this ended. A lot of this had to do with the construction of the State Water Project and increasing requirements on landowners and reclamation districts for levee maintenance, which would eventually destroy and end a lot of the capacities for recreation activities in the Delta. And so that's why if you look in newspaper articles or in old magazines, you can find really diverse recreational pursuits among all the communities of Stockton. And by the 1970s, the Delta had essentially become a province for white yachters and fishermen. And of course, during this time period, it became really critical for the Delta to be classified and taxonomized by the Department of Water Resources. And so in the early 1990s, you saw the introduction of terms such as the primary zone and the secondary zone used to designate the areas that were part of the Delta or not part of the Delta. And really what this did, if you look at the primary zone, it's basically just the agricultural spaces. And then the secondary zone adds some parts of Stockton, basically adds Brentwood, Discovery Bay, Antioch, Oakley, Pittsburgh, adds Tracy. But really what this did, because the primary zone is the zone that really mattered with regards to political processes, it marginalized the human histories, cultures, and societies of the region. At just the same time, the 1990s is when you start to see a lot of representation in politics of people of color and women in this region, right? A lot of Stockton's first city council people of color were elected in the 90s. And if you actually look at the documents regarding why some areas were secondary zone and not primary zone, a lot of it had to do with reducing the potential for litigation from the cities of Stockton, Brentwood, Pittsburgh, and Antioch. And another really less discussed example, in the wake of the Vietnam War, there was a massive wave of immigrants and refugees from Southeast Asia, which again, don't have a lot of time to go into. It's worth noting that the Delta was listed as one of the regions that was best suited for taking in migrants because these migrants were oftentimes not educated by Western standards. They might have been highly educated in their home cultures, but I think the immigration policy of the time in the United States was very racist, right? And of course, when these communities got to the Delta, there was not necessarily a lot of labor for them because by that point, the Delta had essentially automated a lot of its agriculture. And last but not least, and this is really critical, state policy in the Delta as a housing shed. In the past 30 years, because of the designation of some parts of the Delta as a secondary zone, quote unquote, if you go back and look at the law, a lot of the secondary zone became essentially a housing shed for the Bay Area and Sacramento. And what I'm getting at here is that during the same time period in the Bay Area, you saw a lot of housing policies that were designed to push out people of color and other low-income communities from the Bay Area. There's a term called the West Bay Wall, where the West Bay, I think in between 1970 and like 2010, basically built fewer homes than the city of Brentwood. So like Santa Clara, San Francisco, and San Mateo counties, I think in that time period, like did not build as many homes as the city of Brentwood. Which is pretty, wild if you look at that. This is the time period where Brentwood was, where Discovery Bay was constructed. The towns of Tracy and Lathrop expanded dramatically to accommodate this large outflux of disenfranchised service workers from the Bay Area. And the Delta was really seen as a housing shed and discussed as such in state policy from that time period, which is one of the reasons why the Delta today has such a large commuter population of low-income people of color who do not have the time or energy due to the economic structure of the Northern California megaregion to participate in political processes, which is a huge problem today and something that we're dealing with in San Joaquin, Sacramento, and East Contra Costa counties. Thank you. Whew, that was a lot of history. Okay, stopping the share. I've got 30 minutes or so. And I don't know who we want to start with.
Philip, I just can't say enough. Thank you. I think there's no way for me to even make comment that does justice to everything you covered today and that Melissa has covered. I just think we're going to have to do another webinar in about 2 weeks. What I want to do right now is I would like to hear from Dylan and from Nancy and Tama and Val. Have them talk about what it is that you presented today. Or if Elaine, I don't know who joins sooner, Elaine or Dylan, I'll let you two figure that out. And we'll take it from there. You have to unmute your mics, either Dylan or Elaine, if you want to comment or ask questions about Philip's presentation.
Sure. Philip's, and I apologize for coming late. I had another panel, but well aware of Philip's work, and I want to thank him for it, and I want to thank him for his hair as well. All right. So I guess what we can kind of just add on to as far as, bringing up to date, like some of the issues that Philip, brought about is kind of how we've emerged as an organization, Little Manila Rising, that is. My name is Dylan Delva. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Little Manila Rising. And we start out in 2000 in the world of historic preservation. But what we found with the continuing destruction of the Little Manila Chinatown area, which was formerly destroyed by the Crosstown Freeway, what was left was up for destruction as well. And in the headline of that newspaper article, when they talked about the destruction of Little Manila, they said, the headline was "Corner of History Falls to Progress," right? Like that was the headline. And Dr. Don Mabalan and I, who co-founded the organization, looked at that and said, wow, the fact that that block was destroyed to build a McDonald's and a 76 station. And the fact that it was the majority of people in Stockton actually saw that as progress. And we set out to, we realized that we had to set out to redefine what does progress mean in our community, if that's the way people define progress in the year 2000. And so, so we set out to do that. And we are, grounded in this history that Philip has talked about, obviously because we have a Filipino background, that's emphasis to us, but we are in allyship with all of the historical ways communities have been marginalized. And so the work that we do today, we are not a museum. Oftentimes people, confuse us with the Philippine American National Historic Society and their work, and they're doing important, amazing work, and they definitely need to be supported. But our work is really rooted in this history of marginalization and the compounded history of marginalization, because what happened when we had to engage in saving our historic site was that we had to engage with a community that was no longer Filipino, right? There was only one Filipino family in that neighborhood. It was mostly Black, Mexican, and Chinese. And what started out as historic preservation then became this idea of how we have been marginalized for decades and for generations. And so we're a lot more concerned about that than specifically being the representative for the Filipino community. We're grounded in the history, but please don't silo us in this Filipino thing, because I think that's trying to silo and limit our work. And so anyway, when we organized, we had to confront this historical culture of racial inequity. And so how we've grown is that we have programs in Indigenous arts, including dance, music, and drama. Val will talk a little more about that later. We're involved in educational equity through ethnic studies, not just for Filipinos, but for all people. We're empowering young voices through our youth advocates for social and racial justice programs. And we're now tackling environmental justice, specifically around air quality and asthma. And I want to send a shout out to Barbara, because really she's the one that's been here for decades, begging for people to get involved. And the simple truth is that our communities have always been so focused on just survival that environmental justice really was kind of this thing that we didn't really have time for. But now we don't have the luxury of kind of putting that off to the side. We have to engage in that now. And we had to learn that the hard way, because our co-founder, Dr. Don Mabalon, who was born and raised in South Stockton, we were both raised in a formerly redline community. She died 2 years ago of an asthma attack. And so environmental justice is extremely relevant to us. And we now come to this from a very organic standpoint. And with that said, we are now helping to co-lead Stockton's AB 617 efforts, tackling air quality in the area. And we've helped to institutionalize ethnic studies in our high schools. We successfully advocated for a Dreamer Resource Center at Delta College. And we were a litigant against the UC Regents for the use of SAT for college admissions, which the UC Regents have just decided to get rid of. So I think our work is really, based in this history of racial inequity. We see Little Manila not just as this Filipino historic site, but really the doorway to South Stockton, the doorway to racial inequity, and what that has meant to the development of Stockton, and how that still impacts us today and our future is what we're really concerned about. And yeah, I think I should just stop there, because I'll just keep going on and on. But I think we definitely want to recognize that we're telling a story that really begins in our native indigenous roots of a land that's been stolen and then occupied by landowners, and then other communities being marginalized on top of that. We want to build upon that story and understand that this story, our present day story of marginalization, comes from those experiences. And we are begging for community leaders, institutions to confront this simple truth so that we can move on and have real progress.
That was really well put, Dylan, and I thank you. Again, there's not enough time for me to do justice to what you said. And so I'm going to ask Nancy Wante if she could unmute. And I know you have some things that you wanted to add today, and you could talk about Philip's presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for sharing your pieces so far. I've learned a lot from Stockton. I think that when I came into this work and I was an ethnic studies major, I learned from everywhere and except for Stockton. I think I'm just beginning to piece together. And it was through ethnic studies. Like ethnic studies put that bug in there. Like you need to go home and ask questions from not just my parents and grandparents, but also like the community, like community history. And so I appreciate you all going through that rich history and then also lived experience from like your own family members, your antepasados, and figuring out like in what ways future generations, right, can enrich themselves as they live, as they also move through some of these injustices that Dylan named and that also Philip named throughout history. So I actually want to share specifically about the Bracero program, because those are some of the questions that I asked my family. So how did we get here? How did we get to Stockton? Like Barbara mentioned in the beginning, I was born in Mexico. I, migrated here with my mom and dad when I was 4 years old. But previous to that, my grandpa had already been here. He had established, like his sisters were living here. He had lived here. There had been a whole line of like the Guante part of my identity that had been in Stockton, but I knew nothing of like what that meant or what it looked like. So I started asking questions to my grandpa at first when he was still alive and with us. And then later on, continued that process by looking at pictures and looking at different letters that were written between my grandpa, Tomas, and my grandma, Adelita. And what I've noticed was that basically the Bracero program was messed up. Like it provided access to them to come work, but it was cheap labor. So there was a lot of, in terms of policy and like politicians getting involved, like the public law 75, public law 78, which kind of like overlooked the migration of workers in California. Like my grandpa talked a lot about that. And at that moment when he would tell me, I wasn't really clear of what that meant or what it looked like. And after a couple times of like doing research and reading some books around Chicanx history, I realized that cheap labor had a very, basically had a big impact in the Guante family, right? In terms of like internalized oppression and not wanting to ask for more or not knowing how to resist, even though they were resisting in their own ways. Like as a community, it was really hard to pinpoint what they were asking for, which obviously was more money for their labor, which at that time was 30 cents an hour. And, the public law asked that they were treated as humans, whatever that meant for them at that point. But all of that was a violation, right? Like the growers and the people that were contracting the braceros did not follow that public law. It did not follow even the narratives, right, of the people. And so my grandpa shared a lot about what that meant in terms of like being hungry all the time, even though he worked endless hours in the fields. He talked about like just the movement of it, like physically, like what it meant to move around different communities. I think his first, when he became a bracero in 1947, his first site was Carpinteria, California, which is close to Santa Barbara. And then they had him move between Santa Paula and Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, Santa Maria. And then eventually that picture that you showed, Philip, where they were in the train.
Yeah.
He talked a lot about the trains coming up north to Salinas. And then from Salinas, taking a bus into Stockton, Linden, and all these other areas, all up into Sacramento. And so I wanted to uplift his story as a way to like add narratives, because a lot of the time when we go through history, and I think you all pointed out this earlier, we see it as a very like linear, like this is what happened, but like we don't hear about the stories in between, like the people that lived some of these policies and practices. And so I thought about just my own journey and like figuring out like, what about my grandpa that made it, that is important, or that is responding to the bracero, things like the bracero program was important for me to share. And I do have a picture that I want to share of him, just so that you all also have a visual of who my grandpa was. So I'll share that right now. Oh, it says I'm not able to. Okay, never mind. I won't share it.
No, Nancy, I just so you should be able to share it now.
Yay. Okay. So I posted this one on Instagram last night because my dad sent it to me really late. But like this was 1947. He was 19 years old in this picture. And he hadn't yet married my grandma, but they were in between doing that. And it was just, I don't know, it's just something about looking at things such as pictures from that time, like makes it more human, like what we're talking about. Like, 'cause I think that sometimes gets lost, like in this conversation of like history and policy and all this stuff. So I just wanted to share his image and like know that he's probably with us in this moment, right? Sharing the space as we talk about the things that really impacted the Mexican American community and others in this area. The last thing I will say as I close is that I just want to name that there was so many sort of like transitions, and I think Philip gave into this, right? Like we had just finished the Treaty of Guadalupe, or the United States and Mexico, right, had just finished those treaties, amongst other treaties and other things that, you know, compañera Melissa was talking about earlier within the indigenous communities. We also looked at repatriation, right, of the 1920s, the Civil War in Mexico, which lasted like 30 years. So all of that was in flux, and it impacted so much the identity of what being a Mexican was and meant up until this day. I think we have a huge identity crisis as Mexicanos. And a lot of it has to do with national politics, and then obviously the effects of racism, sexism, and more that we, again, we're at a time and can't speak to that. But I think until now, there is so much room. And I know the Chicano Research Center here in Stockton has built a really cool library for us to like go check out books about, you know, folks who are writing about the Chicanx experience in the Valley, but also across the nation. So I just want to give them a quick shout out. Because their work is huge, it's big, and it's gonna help. And it's here in Stockton, which is huge. When we talk about Chicano research centers, I think we hold 1 in 3 centers across the nation, officially named Chicano research centers. So I just want to put that out there. And again, like this work, it sounds like we're passionate and grounded in this history, and I want to just give kudos to Restore the Delta for putting the space together in the panel. But I'm going to mute myself to give others the opportunity to chime in.
Nancy, we can't thank you enough. I'm wondering, can you tell us where the research center is located in Stockton?
Yeah, so they just moved. They used to be on Main Street by Filbert Street, but now they're on Main Street downtown. Actually, we're close to, I'm not sure of the correct address. I'll look it up right now and post it. But it was near actually where Little Manila Rising used to be downtown.
Yeah, it's actually at the old Aztec Discoteca, Chicanx nightclub that was very big in amongst the Chicanx migrant communities. Richard Soto, the guy who runs it, he's a really great guy.
Right.
He's a good scholar, a really great community organizer. I can't endorse him enough.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Nancy, for sharing your family's story and linking it up to the history that we covered today. We're grateful. Tama, I'm going to turn it over to you. You ready?
Yep, I'm ready. Hey, Mariah, did you get those pictures?
Yes, ma'am. Would you like me to share the screen now?
I sent you one other, if you could check your text real quick.
Yes, I got that and I added it.
Oh, can I have that one up first?
Yes, you can. Give me
Okay,
just
hi everybody. I'm Tama Brisbane. I'm the executive director and co-founder of With Our Words. We are a nonprofit here in Stockton that works with youth and young adults, particularly from marginalized communities and communities of color. We use the art forms of slam poetry and spoken word. I am also Stockton's poet laureate. And this is a picture of the launch of the SS Booker T. Washington, which is one of the first it's the first battleship named after a person of color. And the two women that you see there, the little bitty tiny one is the founder of Bethune-Cookman College. That is Mary McLeod Bethune. Next to her is Marian Anderson, opera singer. Some of you know her history, being forced to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial because the Daughters of the American Revolution didn't want her to sing in Lincoln Center. And the man standing on the far right is my grandfather, Charles Henry Anderson. And he was one of the welders, one of the many African-American welders who actually constructed the SS Booker T. Washington. And that photograph is one of several that's in the Library of Congress. And so growing up in Los Angeles, which is actually a port city, and so coming to reside in yet another port city, Stockton, and knowing the problematic history that Stockton has with its communities of color and the erasure specifically of African-American contributions to the port, which I did not know until Philip's presentation. And so it just sent me on a mad rush to find that photograph to show the linkage of one port to another. And Philip, I just have to stop here and thank you for an incredible body of work and a presentation that's going to add to the writing prompts that I think started with Melissa, with the Delta being a grocery store. My work is not so much engaging history as trying to disengage the youth and young adults I work with from history so that they can fight through the problems of their history and get to the Delta, to begin to engage the Delta. Because first we have to tackle the problems of water for African Americans as the conveyance of captivity. So we got to get over that one. The next thing that we have to tackle is land in this country, and even in the Delta, as the killing fields, where their historical labor has been exploited. Then we have to talk about what it means for young Black people to connect to the Delta from a place of reverence, when historically they're not invited. Historically, the Delta is presented as the sole province of white people, whereby I have white students who grow up boating and water skiing and kayaking and all of these kinds of recreational activities that my Black students, because of poverty, because of circumstance, don't have access to. And so there's almost this whites only, not necessarily a sign, but there is an aura of whites only when it comes to perceiving the Delta as a place of engagement, a place of recreation, a place that can be protected, that you can be an advocate of. It is an uphill work that we have undertaken for the last 15 years. We are making progress. We are beginning to show young people that there is a place for you in this Delta. There is a place for your voice. It is a place worth protecting, worth advocating, worth writing about, worth going to Sacramento and testifying on behalf of. And it doesn't mean that you negate the history, but now let's learn it and fold it into the art form that we practice, because we have elevated stages, we have elevated opportunities to create spaces for youth and young adults of color inside of the Delta and the larger green movement, which is still overwhelmingly white. I think the most haunting thing one of my students ever said to me was, Mama T, I get it, but I'm too busy being brown to be green. I'm too busy being brown to be concerned about the Delta. I can't afford to be blue. This country cares more about blue whales than it cares about Black people or brown people. And I carry that sentiment with me in my work. I look to people like Nancy and Dylan and now Melissa, and especially Barbara and Mariah and Restore the Delta, to give me the histories and the data so that I can begin to correct that perception, because we're looking at developing the next generation of Delta participants and protectors, and yes, even poets. And they're waiting to expose and examine and exchange the current language that we use to talk about the Delta with new phrases, to develop a new lexicon that involves all of their voices. And so to the people that are in our audience, those of you who are representatives of agencies and organizations, you may see yourself as stakeholders, but you are also gatekeepers, you're door openers, you're project collaborators, and some of you might even be project funders. And so my question to you is, where are you? Because there are young people here that need your participation, that are looking to know that they are valued, that their histories are valued, that their voices are valued. And if you want to utilize the genius of my fellow presenters and empower and activate these next generations, where are you? Thanks.
Thanks, Tama. Thank you for all the good words. And last, but very importantly, because I think you probably have some more to add, Belle, I want to ask you to please unmute your mic, and you can share your closing remarks with Philip, and then Elaine, if you have anything else to add to Dylan's presentation, and I think we'll wrap up from there. Okay.
Hi, this is Val Valacoba, and I am the director of Red Phoenix Rising, which is part of Little Manila Rising. So I have close connections to Dylan, and I'm a native Stocktonian, and I share. My husband is Filipino. I am Chinese. I grew up in the Chinatown that I-5 destroyed when Stockton was made better with the Crosstown Freeway. I'm very proud of being a Stocktonian. I have always been a advocate for cultures. Other cultures. I grew up here in Stockton, went to Stagg, which when I went to Stagg was mostly a Caucasian school. And I did not learn very much about my culture. So I've always in my teaching career tried to engage young people in appreciating other cultures. On my husband's side, he's Filipino. He grew up, his father came to the Lathrop area in the 1920s, and he grew up on a Filipino-owned farm, not from his father, but from his older brother. So my thing is, and I love you, Tama, is to work through the arts so that young people can appreciate the different cultures in our totally diverse Stockton. My theater company presents plays so that young people can express themselves. And well, I've been teaching so long that a lot of my young people are, well, are people that are now ethnic studies leaders in our community. I am very pro education of history that is more like what Philip writes. And I'm very appreciative of Philip, and which is why my husband and I are now docents at the museum to help diversify happenings that go on there. So Philip, thank you very much. This was wonderful. I used to live across from the World War II, on the levee at the World War II boats that African Americans probably built. And I didn't know that information. So it's amazing. That's just wonderful. And they were housed on the waterways of the Stockton Slough and Canal, which was probably dug out by Chinese Americans many years before that. So this is a wonderful, important program, this webinar, and I hope that you guys do continue it. I'm hoping to show it to some of my young people. My plays are of all different nationalities, mostly folk tales, because people don't know their folk tales, and I have crossed over through Mexican American, Asian American, Filipino American. I've helped with the local Black theater in town. So I'm hoping that the young people that participate in my programs, I mean, they're our life. I mean, like Thomas says, okay, they are our future. And so if they can know how to express themselves and know their value, well, that's what's important. And their value is where they come from. Thank you, Barbara.
That was so beautifully put. Thank you so much. And so I'd like to give the last closing words to Elaine and to Philip.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Philip, for being able to present the histories of our people. Hi, everyone. Elaine Barut, Senior Program Manager for Little Manila Rising. And some of the things that Dylan said, I think it's truly empowering. All the folks here on the panel are truly empowering, and we link it back to our ancestors, our communities in history, how they fought really hard, overcoming adversities, overcoming the struggles. And when we look back at history, they fought for us. And so we need to continue to fight for their legacies, bring it into our young people. I'm kind of sad that I'm not considered in that category anymore as a young person, but being able to bridge that connection for our next generation, and being able to show that they are going to be the ones who are continuing our current legacies here in Stockton, fighting for oppression, fighting for our health, for everything that is affecting them today now, for our Black and Brown communities. And so give them space, give the young people, bring them to the table, let them learn, show and guide them. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it on my end. So thank you for allowing me to share the space with you all today.
Thanks for being here. Yeah, I guess I guess Barbara will ask me to end. I think that the one critical thing that I think has been the specter behind all of this conversation is that the stories of this place are typically not told. And if you look at the stories that are often told about the Delta, about this region, about the people in this region, they're few and far between. They really are. And that has a really negative impact on everybody that lives here and everybody that has lived here. And if we as a community want to face the ghosts and crimes of our past, we have to know the stories of our past and the stories of today and the stories of tomorrow. And so I encourage the 36 people that are still on the call, as well as the panelists, although I'm not so worried about the panelists. And I'm just looking at people who I see on the call. I see people who are interested in storytelling, who are doing work on anthologies in Delta literature. I encourage you to broaden your horizons. Not that your horizons may not already be broad, but to really to think outside the box about the types of stories that we tell. The late historian Don Mabalan, who's been brought up multiple times, she told me once that the Delta is the hardest place to study in the United States, as regions go, and that's true because so many of our communities have been destroyed. There have been cultures of throwing away records, of not publishing stories. One thing I didn't mention, all of those communities that I talked about had their own newspapers, and they're all gone. Fortunately, some of the Japanese newspapers were written in Japanese and saved in Tokyo. That's how I've been able to read them. They're really diverse literary cultures and historical cultures in the Delta that deserve to have their stories told. And if this lecture and these panels have been anything, I hope they were a call to action to tell those stories. That's it.
So with that, I want to thank everyone for participating today. I think we broke a record for a Restore the Delta webinar in terms of length of time, but the time was needed. Melissa, Tama, Elaine, Philip, Nancy, and Dylan, thank you sincerely. We look forward to working with you all in the future. Take care.